Welcome, everybody. It is lovely to see you all. It feels like it has been some time since we have gathered to celebrate another tractate of Talmud. My name is Rachel Scheinerman. I edit My Jewish Learning, and this is, of course, our Siyyum, our virtual event to celebrate our completion together of the study of Tractate Bava Metzia. If you have been with us since the beginning of the Daf Yomi cycle, then we are now more than 1,600 days into our study of Daf Yomi, which leaves us just over 1,000 to go. If you haven't been with us since January 5th of 2020, never fear, because really, when it comes to Talmud, there's no true beginning and no true end. So all are welcome at all times to jump on and move through the texts with us at any point. And today is one of those days that especially feels like not exactly a beginning and not exactly an end, of course, because this is the second of three connected tractates, the Bavas, the gates, right? So all three of the Bava tractates, we began with Bava Kama. Today we're celebrating Bava Metzia, and we will start tomorrow with Bava Batra. All of them concern civil law and financial transactions between individuals. We've talked about property damage and renting and borrowing and sales, and it gets very complicated. And there's a lot of nitty gritty. There's a lot to discuss. So we are going to, though, enjoy that we have come to this milestone at the end of this tractate. And as is usual for our Siyyum program, we have three wonderful experts on the call to talk about some of their favorite moments in this tractate, but we also invite you to share yours in the comments. We really love hearing from you, and other people enjoy reading what you write. So please tell us what struck you as you read Bava Metzia. What stood out to you? What questions linger with you? What frustrated you? What gave you a whole new perspective, a whole new understanding? What inspired you? Please share that, and we will, as the course of the event, as the course of the hour goes, we will bring some of your questions to the panelists. So let me now introduce them. These folks are probably familiar to you if you have been with us for a while, and if not, then good folks to get to know. So let me introduce who we have with us today. Rabbanit Dasi Fruchter, would you wave your hand, please?
Hello, Mazel Tov, everyone.
Rabbanit Fruchter is the spiritual leader of the South Philadelphia Shtibel and the popular teacher of a very popular daily Daf Yomi class. Rabbi Elliot Goldberg, very regular writer for our series.
Hi, everybody. Mazal Tov.
Okay, Rabbi Goldberg is an executive coach and consultant with more than 2 decades of experience in Jewish day schools and a lifetime of summers at Ramah camps. I believe you're broadcasting from Ramah right now. Is that correct?
Broadcasting from my shack by the lake at Camp Ramah, New England.
Okay. And finally, we are joined by Dr. Sarah Ronis. You hear from her pretty much every week in the email series as well. Dr. Ronis.
Hi, everyone. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov.
Dr. Ronis is a professor of theology at St. Mary's University, where she teaches courses on the Hebrew Bible and its interpretation, and the author of a recent book on demons in the Talmud. Please, as I said, go ahead and share your comments, thoughts, and suggestions. But we are going to go ahead and start with some reflections from our three panelists of moments and ideas that stood out to them from this tractate. So Rabbi Goldberg, why don't you kick us off here?
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Hello, everybody. The text I want to speak about is from the middle of the Masachet. It's Bava Metzia, Mishnah 4.3, actually. We're going to look at just the Mishnah and not of the Gemara about it. I love this Mishnah because it shows a little bit about the interaction between the conversations that the rabbis had in the Beit Midrash and how they played out on the street with the people. Much of the Talmud focuses on the rabbinic conversations between rabbis, and this Mishnah gives us a window into like what happens when the people some of these rules respond to the rulings and how that impacts what the law actually is. The middle of chapter 4 of Bava Metzia, if you remember, talks about ona'ah, which the Steinsaltz translation, which is our go-to one for my Jewish learning, calls exploitation. It's sometimes also translated as fraud. The rabbis, the nitty-gritty of the details, Rachel, I like how you said that in the introduction. The nitty-gritty here is in the marketplace, when you have an object that you're selling, how much can the merchant mark up the price? At what point is the sale price fraud or exploitation? And the rabbi set some limits about what merchants can do to prevent us from exploiting each other, which the Torah forbids us to do. The Torah forbids us to do it, doesn't provide any of the nitty-gritty details, and this Mishnah does so. So the Mishnah says, that, which means fraud is set at 4 silver coins out of a total of 24 silver coins, which if you do the math, that means it's 1/6. So the rabbis set a standard that with the assumption that products have value in the marketplace, and if you're the merchant and you're gonna sell it, you're allowed to add to the value of a product up to 1/6 of its value. And if you stay within that 1/6 markup, the sale's fine. It's not exploitation, and that's how our marketplace can work. And if you go beyond, the buyer can cancel the sale because the price is just too high. So the Mishnah starts, it gives us that standard, and if nothing else had happened, that would have been the standard and we would have moved forward. Spoiler alert, when we get to the end, this will be the standard at the end, but we have this story that the Mishnah brings in the middle, which goes, for the story. I forgot the second point. That will make the story make sense. Fact one, you can add up to 1/6 of the product. The Mishnah then asks the question, how long does someone who's been exploited have to return the objects, right? I bought something, I think you charged me more than, right, 7/6 of its value. I want to go back and return the object, get my money back. The Mishnah says you have until you have a chance to show it to an expert or family member. It's a vague phrase in a first reading because it just says until, like, how do they know how long it takes me to show it to an expert or a family member? We think the logic here says, right, you bought something, you're not an expert, you can consult with somebody, find out what it's worth, find out if you paid a fair price, and then you can come back and get your money back once you've checked it out. I don't even know if this exists anymore, but I know in the diamond district in New York, if you're searching for a diamond for an engagement ring, you can like take the diamond from the diamond store to an expert who sits in a booth on the street or something and show it to them, at least in my day, right? And you get an expert to say, are they charging me a fair price? Was the price that the merchant did, you get it appraised, then you go back and you decide if you're buying that diamond for your ring or not. It seems that was the system here for whatever good you're buying in the marketplace. So 1/6 is the markup, and you have until you can show it to somebody and get some advice to return it. Now we get to the story. Once upon a time in the town of Lod, Rabbi Tarfon shows up, and he announces that instead of 1/6, merchants can mark up the price 1/3. So instead of, right, it's a double markup, right? 1/3 as a fraction of the whole is 33%, right? Twice as big as 1/6. And the Mishnah tells us when he marks it up to 1/3, at first the merchants are excited. Why? Because if legally I can charge up to 1/6 on the old system, and Rabbi Tarfon lets us go up to 1/3, that sounds awesome to them. They can make more money. Then Rabbi Tarfon says the following about the second question: how long do they have to return does a buyer have to return the object? Rabbi Tarfon says you have the entire day. And the Mishnah tells us the merchants are sad, and they say to Rabbi Tarfon, we want to go back to the original ruling. We don't like it. If you've been following and as you study this Mishnah, there's a moment of a logical pause. Wait a minute. Before it said 1/6, and I have until I can show it to a merchant. And my first assumption, the first time I ever saw this Mishnah, is that's an indefinite amount of time. I can go home, I can cook dinner, I can consult the next day with an expert and come out whatever. And Rabbi Tarfon saying, just till the end of the day, that you have to the end of the day. It feels like at first, Rabbi Tarfon's good on both the questions. Bigger threshold and a shorter return time, which is both good for merchants, because like you could sell, make more of a profit, and you know the sale is final pretty quick. But the merchants say, we don't want Rabbi Tarfon, leave us alone. We're going to go back to the original amount, which leads us to rethink the original position, because it's that last piece where Rabbi Tarfon says, only till the end of the day, but you have till the end of the day, that makes the merchants change their mind. And when you go back to the reading and you see how the Gemara reads it, the first phrase for the original position that says 1/6, when it says, until you show it to a merchant, it ends up that can't mean logically and ends up not meaning, and how the rabbis of the Gemara understand it, and the commentators later, that you have as much time as it takes to ask a family member or an appraiser or an expert, what's the price? It means you have just that amount of time. So I buy something, I have the time it would take from when I leave the store to go call my mom or FaceTime my dad, or go to the next store down the street and say, did I get a good price? And then to go right back and do it. That's a really, really quick time. And all day, it turns out, in the Mishnah, Rabbi Tarfon's position is longer. And so what do we learn about this? The merchants of Lod say, oh, at first, we like the legal profit at 1/3, we can make more money. But wait, you're expanding the return time from 1/6, from the consulting, which is like right after and quick, to the full day. We like the original rule. And we go back to the original rule and it stays there. Tells us something also about the merchants in this case, because the way in which this would make sense for the merchants to like the Tanakama, the opening opinion over Rabbi Tarfon, is if they're going to try to beat the system by charging as much as possible. They're not going to look at the fraud limit that the Mishnah imposes. Because if they do 1/6, then you have a short window. The merchants are willing to take a shorter profit amount on the condition that the return time is really short, because they're not going to stick to the 1/6. They're going to overcharge. They're going to be fraudulent, but they're going to bet on the fact you're not going to check it out fast enough to return the product. And they're going to give up Rabbi Tarfon, who allows them legally more profit, because he gives their potential buyer a much longer time to find out that the sale was fraudulent. So in some ways, some of the warning of this Mishnah is buyer beware, because the merchants might be out to get you. But it shows also this back and forth. And what I like about this Mishnah is we could have a moment where the first opinion 1/6 and the second opinion 1/3 between Rabbi Tarfon and the return time opinions play out with what we don't ask, what verse do these comes from? What's the logic between these different rabbis? Which do we want to choose? We see the opinions of the merchants play out in the marketplace, here potentially fraudulent merchants who don't want to stick to the spirit of the law. But the story shows us that eventually where the law lands is not based on the merits in the Beit Midrash of the argument between the first opinion and Rabbi Tarfon. It's about how the people have to actually, or some of the people have to implement this law, actually land. And it's the merchants who pushed Rabbi Tarfon and his opinion away, and we end up with 1/6 being the limit for fraud, and a really short return time, which means you have to check it out. And what that means for all of us today is we're lucky that this section of Jewish law has deferred to Dina de Malchuta Dina, which is the principle that civil law follows the law of the land. And in the culture that most of us, I think, given where I saw when you said hi and where you were calling from or zooming from, live in places where merchants have very liberal return policies because they want your business, operating with a very different assumption than the merchants in Lod in the rabbinic area. And I'm so happy with that today, because this system seems stacked to favor the merchants. We live in an age where the consumer sort of has a leg up. That's that. Mishnah 4:3 from Bava Metzia. One of my favorites in the whole Mishnah, and was fun to see in this Masechet.
Thank you, Rabbi Goldberg. It is interesting when we see those shifts, like laws to favor merchants versus laws to favor consumers, which I always wonder to myself, is that really just to favor the merchants, right? This idea that the customer is always right seems to be to some degree a product of capitalism. And ultimately, I wonder, I'm curious what other folks think. Please share in the comments. Lots of interesting comments coming in from you and observations about what you enjoyed in this tractate, what you learned. So let me just share a few of them quickly before we move forward. A lot of you, I think, seem to appreciate how the situations dealt with here are very analogous to situations in the modern world, right? These are not specifically Jewish situations in most cases. These are just financial arrangements between colleagues, coworkers, employers, employee, neighbors, and so forth. So for instance, Sarah said, I particularly enjoyed the sections on worker protections. And Elizabeth said, my mother always taught us to pay workers ASAP. It was nice to see those words and that sentiment in the daily daf. Lizzie, who lives in Somerville, Mass. I've lived there, Lizzie, said the discussion of upstairs and downstairs felt very real for multi-sensory Somerville apartments. I've lived in one of those too. Rob appreciates that we learned about, this is amusing aside, an amazing utensil, a fork on one end and a spoon on the other. I guess the precursor to the modern spork, right? Diana says she appreciated the wise warning about volunteering as a guarantor for your fellow. Brian said, I found the responsibility of the landlord to accommodate their renter if the property collapsed to be meaningful. The balance favored the renter there, it seemed. And he compared that to the current situation in the UK, where the law largely favors the landlord. Elizabeth, I've rented in Somerville, and Brian, I have also rented in London before, believe it or not. And yes, had that issue in London. So I know what you're talking about. Beyond these laws that deal with sort of universal situations in almost every society. People also pointed to some of the beautiful and really resonant stories that we found in the daf. And I know that we're going to have more opportunity later in this session to talk about them. But Dita said, we can't pass this tractate by without noting that we got to read the Oven of Achnai, which is probably one of the most famous stories in all of Talmud about just how much power do the rabbis have. Is it in heaven or is it on earth with the rabbis? Susan points out that we also had the famous and tragic story of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, two of the most famous chevrutot, learning partners in all of Talmud. And Diana loved the story of Rabbi Baravu meeting Elijah at the cemetery. Sylvia's thought an interesting takeaway and insight from the tractate was that in ancient times, lending money was thought of as a form of charity more than a form of business, right? Today, we think of lending money as a business because you can charge interest, but in the ancient Jewish world, charging interest is prohibited by the Torah, and so it is actually considered a form of charity. And Naomi Bar Yam, are you there, Naomi? I'd actually like to ask you about your question. Ben, maybe we can get Naomi onto the screen. She said she read this tractate with an eye to two things: what the question and rulings meant in their day and how we apply them today. And she said it struck her differently in this tractate. So Naomi, I wonder if you would explain to us what struck you differently in this tractate.
I was thinking about that, and I think it's mostly the Bavas, right? The triplet Bava Masechtot are really they're civil law, and they're the most practical, that we can see how that as we've been saying, that some of the issues that arose in the Talmud still arise today. And what I've been thinking about is what are the broader principles that we take from it that can be applied today.
So it's sort of the universalism of the material.
Yeah.
Makes it feel different.
I think so.
It makes it feel different. Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions. Carla asked one that I saw Dr. Ronas already answered in the chat about why we use the word Bava, which means gate, for each of these tractates. And Dr. Ronas explained that that is an ancient word that is used the way we might use volume. So volume one, or really volume the first, volume the middle, and volume the last really might be a better translation of these tractates, which were once a big omnibus tractate called Nizikin, or damages. Karen, you had a question. You said that of all the tractates of the Talmud that Adin Steinsaltz published. He first started with Bava Metzia. I didn't know that. I wasn't aware of what order Adine Seinsaltz published the Tractates of Talmud, but I wonder if anybody on our panel has a thought on that, why Bava Metzia, our tractate, might have been the first one he published. Okay, I'm getting head shakes all around. Nobody's quite sure. So if you have some thoughts, please share in the comments. And Judith, you have a question about upper gardens and lower gardens on the final daf of Talmud. I think I will hold that until we get to the end of this tractate. We'll have a chance to read some of the last lines together. So let's go ahead back to our experts. So we will continue with Dr. Ronis, who is going to talk to us today about how the rabbis sometimes write exceptional halachot just for themselves onto the daf. And please keep the questions and comments coming in the chat. Go ahead, Dr. Ronis.
Wonderful, thank you. So what I wanted to talk about today, I already saw Janine in the chat note, so I'm going to share my screen just to give us an example of this. And this really jumped out at actually at me and at Dr. Scheinerman when we were texting about this, when we got to Bava Metzia 108, because we see these two different halachot, or two different discussions on Bava Metzia 108 that I think offer us some really interesting insight. So first is Bava Metzia 108a. Rav Yehuda said, right, they're talking about a city or a town that has communal needs, right? And back in the day, they didn't necessarily have local property tax or other kinds of taxes like that. So they had head taxes, those went to the state. But if there's a local need, Rav Yehuda said, all contribute for the construction of a wall, or depending on your translation, this is a very weird phrase that only shows up here. So it's possibly the excavation of a tunnel, so some sort of security feature. Right, so everybody in the town has to give money for that, and even orphans, but not Torah scholars. Why? Torah scholars do not need protection. All right, so again, this is some sort of military or strategic defensive structure. But for the digging of a well, if everybody has to contribute for the digging of a well, even from Torah scholars have to pay in when we're talking about digging a well. And we said this only if they do not go after the town crier to do the work themselves. So if you have somebody who stands up in the middle of town, says, all right, everybody, let's go, you know, with their bugle or whatever the town crier would have looked like at the time. That's what a chaloza is in Aramaic. Then that's sort of what we would today call corvée labor, where everybody in the town is levied a certain number of hours of work to do the work themselves. So if the community is putting money to hire people to do the work, Torah scholars have to put in money. But after the town crier, no. As Torah scholars do not go out after the town crier to perform communal manual labor themselves. So here's this first text, and this is on Bava Metzia 108. Just so you know, I have translated this a little bit differently than the Sefaria. So if you're trying to follow along on Sefaria and you're like, I'm confused, I made some different translation choices here based on the what these words meant in the Babylonian context. So just to be aware of that. Now, what does it mean to say that Torah scholars don't need military protection? Are we saying that they already have God's protection through their Torah study? Or are we saying, well, they're already doing the work of protecting the city through their Torah study? And I'll just note here, if you're sort of picturing Torah scholars, that in the time of the Talmud, almost all Torah scholars, I can't think of one who didn't, had another job. They all had day jobs. And some of those day jobs included hard manual labor. So we have rabbis who are tanners, which was really hard work and also reeked. So are we saying, no, you're already doing this kind of labor? Or are we saying you don't need the protection yourself? But then everybody needs water, and you don't get water through Torah study, apparently. So they do get levied money. And what we're seeing here is essentially that the rabbis are writing themselves out of a communal obligation. But then on the next daf, on the very next, not the next daf, the next amud, the very next side of the folio, we see that they actually privilege themselves in communal obligations in a very different way. Instead of writing themselves out of an obligation, they write themselves into a privileged position of obligation. And here we're talking about the order of precedence for selling a field. So if you're selling a field and you have two potential buyers, and they are offering you the same amount of money, and it would be the same amount of work to sell to either of them, how do you decide which of them you would sell to? Right? So we're not talking where one's offering you more money. We're not talking where one is necessarily further away, and so you're going to have to like hire a courier. Same amount of money, same amount of labor. How do you decide which of the two to sell to? The Talmud on 108b lays out some orders of precedence, right? So if it's these two, who do you sell to? If you have neighbors, some of the neighbors are who abut your field closer to the city, and some abut your field further from the city. Neighbors of the city, neighbors of the field, neighbors of the city have precedence. Okay. A neighbor and a Torah scholar. The Torah scholar has precedence. A relative and a Torah scholar. The Torah scholar has precedence. A dilemma was raised before the sages. A neighbor and a relative, what? Right? It's a neighbor and a relative. Okay, so you've described a neighbor and a Torah scholar, a relative and a Torah scholar, two different kinds of neighbors. How about if we put the neighbor and the relative together? Come and learn. Better a neighbor who is near than a brother who is far. And I'll note that in almost all cases, the Torah scholar has precedence. And they don't seem to think that they need a verse to prove it. We don't get a verse for why the Torah scholar has precedence. Now, I want to just flag that that's really weird because we've privileged neighbors throughout, right? If you are going to sell, if you own property and your sibling owns property and there's a property between you guys and somebody sells it, you and your sibling are supposed to get first dibs, right? The land wants to be united under a single family of ownership, as the rabbis think about it. So the idea that a neighbor would not have precedence or a relative would not have precedence, but a Torah scholar would, is kind of wild. And in fact, the medieval commentators think that's so weird that they explain that this is only talking about a case where a Torah scholar is also a neighbor. So they're only talking about a case, as some of the medieval commentators explain. It's only talking about a case where it's a regular neighbor versus a neighbor who's a Torah scholar. But even still, you might think, well, but the one who has the property closer to the city or who is related to you, right? There's something very weird here. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see some of your faces now. Hi. So, we've seen this throughout our journey in the Daf, but really starkly in these two texts here and in other places in Bava Metzia as well. Obviously, the idea that the rabbis treat themselves as exceptional in the law in all kinds of ways. But it raises a bunch of questions for us, like, what does it mean for the law to see you as exceptional? What does it mean, given that the rabbis are the ones who are producing these legal discussions, right? What does it mean to see yourself as exceptional in the law? And I want to just note, we know that the rabbis care about public perception, not just among other Jews, but also outside of that. We saw that on, for example, Bava Metzia 69, where we had that great case with the two Samaritans. We saw that today in our ending with, and Shapur thought it was a great idea, right? This idea that the rabbis really care what other people think about their laws. So what does it mean that they don't feel that they have to explain their positions here? Right. In fact, it's all medieval and modern commentators who try to understand why they are privileging themselves. But as is so often the case in the Talmud, and I think this is true also with these commentators who are trying to figure out what's going on here, we don't get easy answers. Instead, we're really spurred to ask a set of interconnected questions. questions that should guide how we think about paying taxes, about selling property, and honestly, so much more. And that's, I mean, if anything, the Talmud is a guide to how to ask good questions about living in the world. So, I leave this set of texts that we've sort of been collecting throughout our entire journey in the Daf about rabbinic exceptionalism, with the following questions. What does seeing yourself as exceptional mean for your communal connections? How you fit into the community and how you interact with your neighbors, right? I mean, genuinely, if you are privileged under the law, what does that mean for the other people you live around who might one day be bidding on a property that you are also interested in purchasing, right? How does that shape your neighbor relations? And as we've seen, I think in many places and here as well, the idea of privilege comes with responsibility and with a cost, right? Privilege comes with a cost, both to you and to those you have privilege over. And so I'm reminded here, as I so often am, reading the Daf and also just in life, of Spider-Man's uncle, Uncle Ben, who famously said, with great power comes great responsibility. And so what kinds of exceptional responsibility does this exceptional power and privilege come with for the rabbis, communally and in their everyday interactions? And what kinds of responsibility do we have? Do we each have to each other and the world from our own unique positions of power? And I think really what Tractate Nezikin as a whole is doing is laying all of those pieces out, right? What are our responsibilities to each other in ways, some of which are rooted in Torah, explicitly in written biblical verses, some of which are rooted in questions of personal status, and some of which, as I saw some folks note in the chat, are rooted in local custom, ethical considerations, and a sense that what we do represents ourselves, not just to ourselves, but to the world at large. And so I don't think the Talmud today answers any of those questions, but I think it challenges us to keep asking them. And with that, I will say Mazel Tov again on finishing a really rich tractate. And I will pass it back to Dr. Scheinerman.
Apologies. Thank you so much. All right, we were getting a spirited discussion in the chat about both rabbinic claiming of certain privileges and the advantages and disadvantages of that, and also on why a traditional yeshiva education often starts with Bava Metzia, which I think seems to be the consensus about why Adin Steinsaltz published Bava Metzia first. And I don't have any particular specialized or deep knowledge of that, but I will just add to the discussion in the chat. Please go there to find it. That it strikes me that also in a yeshiva, it is traditional to start Torah education in Leviticus, which is right in the middle, right? Just like Bava Metzia is right in the middle and right in the nitty gritty, which I think is really interesting. So there may be, I wonder, and please feel free to respond and tell me if you agree or disagree. I wonder if there is something to this idea of start in the middle, start in the nitty gritty. Which of course is a plug for why, if you're just joining us for Daf Yomi now, you are in no way late. You are welcome now to start. And this is as good a place as any.
Can I just say, I think we started in grade 7 with Shnaim Ochazim, with the two people who are holding a cloak. And
is that the very beginning of Bava Metzia?
Yeah. And it is
the beginning.
Yeah, we started our Talmud journey there in high school or middle school, I guess. And issues of sharing are really live for tweens in a way that made it very lived for us at the time, right? So from a developmental stage, I think the question of how do you decide who gets stuff is one that resonates with children developmentally as well.
I was wondering about the background, the question. When I got to Talmud study, the entire Hebrew set was available. You know, the Steinsaltz originally wrote his commentary to translate the Talmud into Hebrew for the Hebrew-speaking audience, and it all existed. I know when the English Random House version started, I think Bava Metzia was first, But I wonder if the questioner was asking about like when our Steinsaltz started, and there I don't know if he started with Bava Metzia or with Brachot at the beginning. I don't know if we have publication experts on the call that can weigh in about the original edition. Where did he start? But the question of, and anyways, I don't have any answers, but it piled on the questions in a Talmudic way in terms of whoever started it. I've been thinking about it too in the last few minutes. Anyways.
Okay. We'll keep discussing, but now we're going to move on to Rabbinit Fruchter, who is going to teach us about who's going to take us to a new theological level, which we feel like we maybe get a whole lot of in this tractate. So it's nice to be able to go there. And she's going to explore that in the laws of returning lost objects.
Thank you so much. And to my esteemed colleagues, that was really interesting stuff. Dr. Onis, I'm just thinking also about the halachot, the laws of paskening for oneself, of giving yourself the answers to halachic questions. Huge problem in the realm of nida, of paskening, of creating your own answers in certain areas. So I also am thinking about just Dr. Onis's presentation. Are there differences in different areas, and why, around rabbis having different privileges, of having exceptions? Okay, let's get into it. I'm noticing so many random current event comments in the chat, which is like so interesting because it's true. When we learn the daf, we are awakened to ways that our ancient tradition is an echo of things that happen today. What's a harder echo to hear sometimes is the stuff that's really about our internal lives, right? So it's very easy to be like, oh, I remember actually, I think in the last Daf Yomi cycle, the Bava Basra, which is about to come up, it starts with two people building a wall, right? And it was during the Trump campaign, I think. So it was all about like that stuff for the wall, and everyone wanted to like talk about this, and it's so easy to go there. And I would love to go to the place that's a little bit harder to access, which is, how can it be, perhaps, that the daf can make us better people? How can we let the halachot around returning lost objects, damages, all of that, how can that teach us a spiritual lesson about what we need to work on within ourselves? I want to talk about the halacha of returning lost objects that we find in the second chapter of Bava Metzia and throughout the tractate. There's a discussion of ad matai chayav lahachriz. How long do you need to tell people that there's a lost object out there? And it says, Kedei ad kedei sheyadu bo shcheinav, until it is known among the neighbors. And there's a discussion. These halachot emerge from the laws found in Exodus and Deuteronomy about encountering our enemy's ox or donkey wandering. We got to return it back to that person. Or if we see our fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, we have to surely return it back to our fellow. Now, the Hasidic readings of these areas of law are fascinating ways to expand on the themes and the values found in the Mishnah. I'm going to tell you about two of them as the final piece of our big section learning today. The Baal Shem Tov shares something about lost objects and says that everything that a person has is connected to the root of their soul. You can imagine this. Your objects that you have in your house, they're connected to the root of your soul. Now, that would be a fascinating organizational project. I would watch that Netflix series, okay, where people organize their homes according to the root of their souls. Anyway, but what the Baal Shem Tov says is that when an object is broken or lost, you don't need to worry, because breaking it or losing it is a sign that you've gotten all you need from it. The object is lost and goes into the hands of another. This is a sign that the object contains sparks, which belong to the other person as well. And the time has now come for them to elevate their sparks. So, of course, when our things are lost and we want to find them, we become really fixated on what that looks like. There's a concept in the Gemara that we see again and again called Yeyush, despairing over a lost object. And Hasidic text often says, don't despair. What does that mean here? It means that once you release hope of retrieving an object or getting it back, you should know that someone else is releasing its sparks. So my action step, or maybe something for us to think about, is there something that someone else has that belongs to you and you wish you had it back, right? You lent it out, you can't get it back, and you kind of feel resentful of that. Can you imagine that right now they're releasing its sparks? So that's one beautiful little text. Another is from the Toldot Yaakov Yosef, who lived in the 18th century. Says in the Torah that you might want to ignore the donkey of your enemy, right? You might feel like you want to ignore, not your enemy. So it says in Devarim, if you see your fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You shall surely return it to your fellow. So what does it mean you will want to ignore them? This one's fun. V'hita lamta mehem. You might want to have nothing to do with lost people, is what he says. So the Toldot Yaakov Yosef says, Torah is not talking about lost objects, it's talking about lost people. And guess what the human instinct is when we see someone who's astray or lost? Our instinct is to ignore, says the Toldot Yaakov Yosef, because they make us uncomfortable. But return them we must, and it was not for nothing that they came into your awareness. And so there's a beautiful idea in the Toldot Yaakov Yosef that what is returning a lost object? It means you shall surely return those who are astray. Is there someone in your life who seems lost and needs a hand to come back into the circle? So these are just two approaches for how the laws of lost objects can speak to our inner selves. And I want to share with you that on every daf, I sometimes challenge myself to think about, is there something here that seems really cut and dry? I mean, sometimes we're like in the locker room with these people, right? With these rabbanim. And we're wondering, how could this really be holy text? What is going on here? And we learn elsewhere in the Gemara that even just the sicha betela, like the little chitter chatter of our great sages, we can learn something from. And so what can we learn from it that helps us become better people, that softens us inside? It's a good reminder, I think, for right at 2/3 the way or less through this giant section that seems to be all about civil damages, where there's really a spiritual reality as well.
Thank you, Rabbanit, for sure. I am looking forward to your Netflix series, the sequel, maybe to Marie Kondo, instead of Spark Joy, Spark Holiness, something like that.
Very, very good.
All right. It is time for us to draw this tractate to a close. We will, of course, hope to return to it one day. And to do that, we are now going to look at the last few lines of the daf. Somebody in the comments, I'm sorry, I lost your name, said that the discussion of the tiered gardens, the upper garden and the lower garden with the vertical wall in between where the plants are growing right out of the vertical wall, was among the most confusing on the page. So we're going to have a chance to revisit it right now. And Dr. Ronas, I believe you are going to lead us through the last few lines of the daf, yes?
Yes, and I have it on my screen to share if that is amenable.
Yep.
Great. So, and as I was looking at this, I was thinking about those, if you ever watch HGTV and they do those vertical walls of herbs now, those really they're very in. I have a black thumb, but I like to watch other people grow things. All right. So the Mishnah taught, Amar Rabbi Shimon, kol she'elyon yachol lifshot, right? So Rabbi Shimon said, any vegetables that the person in the upper garden can sort of reach out and just grab, right? The lower plants have grown up. He can just pull them out. Those are his, right? He has the right to take those things that he can reach. Amrei debei Rabbi Yanai ubulvad shelo ye'enes. And in the school of Rabbi Yanai, they say, and that's only so if he's not doing a circus act. If he has to really stretch himself, those are not his, right? You pull out your step stool, you draw your yoga poses, that's not yours anymore. Anything that you can just reach out and take that's grown up, all yours. The rest are not. Ba'i Rav Anan v'itema Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Anan, and some say it was Rabbi Yirmiyah, asked a question. Magia linofo ve'ein magia li'ikaro, magia li'ikaro ve'ein magia linofo, my. Right, so if you can reach, right, how much of the plant does this upper garden guy have to own, have to be able to reach in order to claim it? Is it just he only has to reach the top bits, or does he actually have to reach into the root of the plant, right? How much of the plant on the wall has to be accessible? And does it matter if it's the top or the bottom that he can reach? If he can reach the roots but not the leaves, or the vice versa? Teku. We don't actually have an answer. We don't know how to resolve this question. It's a good question, though. That's right. A teku is usually a good question. All right. Amar Ephraim Safra Talmido shel Reish Lakish mishum Reish Lakish. Ephraim the scribe, who is a student of Reish Lakish, says in the name of Reish Lakish, Halacha ki Rabbi Shimon. Right, we follow Rabbi Shimon here, that if anything that you can reach out and take is yours, and maybe we don't follow Rabbi Yanai, and maybe you can stretch a little bit more than you would ordinarily. And then we get to this piece that I had mentioned earlier, Amruha kame de shapur malka. Right, so they told this ruling about these vertical gardens to King Shapur, the king of the Sasanian Empire. And I saw a couple of folks in the chat note that if you think about ancient Babylon, it is famous for having elaborate hanging gardens. This is absolutely a geographic feature of this region, specifically Babylonia. Amar lehu afrin nimte l'Rabbi Shimon. He said to them, let us offer praise. This is the Pahlavi word for praise or applause or gratitude to Rabbi Shimon, right? Let us offer praise to Rabbi Shimon. That he gave the exact right answer. If you can reach it, it's yours, says King Shapur. And with that, I will pass it along to Rabbi Goldberg for our hadrons.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Ronis, for ending the Masachet for us. And we'll, by the magic of Zoom, bring up the text of the Hadron. And by the magic of my buttons, I will make it bigger on my screen. I'm dependent on the digital version. Give me just a second to adjust the font so I can. I'm going to hide your faces so I can see the page. All right, there we go. Thank you. Hadran alach masechet Bava Metzia v'hadrach alan. Datach alach masechet Bava Metzia v'datach alan. Lo nina shem minach masechet Bava Metzia v'lo tina shem minan. Lo be'alma deim v'lo be'alma date. Yiratom mefanecha na'elenu le'avotenu shetei taratcha umanutenu be'olam hazeh. V'tei imanu l'olam haba. Chanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Surcha bar Papa, Adar bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Harev Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha mipinu v'fifiot amcha b'Yisrael v'ni anachnu kulanu v'tzetzeinu v'tzetzei amcha b'Yisrael kulanu yudei shemecha v'lamdei Toratecha moivot me'oivai techamcheni mitzvotecha ki leolam hili yehi libi tamim b'chukecha leman lo yivosh leolam lo eshkach pikudecha ki vam chayitani baruch ata Adonai lamdeni chukecha modim anachnu lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu le'avotenu shesamta chalkenu miyoshvei beit midrash velo samta chalkenu miyoshvei kranot שאנו משכימים והם משכימים, אנו משכימים לדברי תורה, והם משכימים לדברים בטלים, אנו עמלים והם עמלים, אנו עמלים מקבלים שכר, והם עמלים ואינם מקבלים שכר, אנו רצים והם רצים, אנו רצים לחיי העולם הבא, והם רצים לבאר שחת, שנאמר, ואתה אלוהים תורידם לבאר שחת, אנשי דמים ומרמה, לא יחצנו ימיהם, ואני אפתח בך. יהי רצון לפניך, אדוני אלוהינו, כשם שעזרתנו לסיים מסכת בבא מציע, כן תעזרנו להתחיל מסכתות וספרים אחרים ולסיימם. ללמוד וללמד, לשמור, לעשות ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה, וזכות כל התנאים והמורים ותלמידי חכמים יעמוד לי ולזרעי, שלא תמוש התורה מפי ומפי זרעי עד עולם, ויתקיים בי, והתהלכה תנחל לך, בשופרך תשמור עליך, והקיצות ההיא תשכיחך, כי בי ירבו ימיך, ויוסיפו לך שנות חיים, אורך ימים, בימינה, בשמאלה, עושר וכבוד. Adonai עוז להם וייתן, Adonai יברך את עמו בשלום. If it's your custom to rise for the Kaddish, you can stand with me. Yikadav Yikadash Shemei Rabbah Be'alma Dehu Atid L'chadata L'chaya Matya L'asakna Yaton L'chaye Alma U'lemivna Karta Dir Shalem U'lesachlela Echala Begava L'me'akar Pulchana Nuchlia Minara Atava Pulchana Dishmei La'atre Yamlich Chucha Brichu B'malchute V'yikrei B'chayachon V'yomechon V'chay L'chol B'Yisrael V'galav V'zman Kariv V'imru Amen Yehei Shmei Rabban Vorach L'Olam Omer Maya Yibarach V'yishtabach V'yipar V'ytomam V'ynaseh V'yitadar V'yitaleh V'yitalal Shmei D'Kudusha Brichu L'Elam Mikol B'chata V'shirata Tushchata V'nechemata D'amiran B'alma V'imru Amen Yehei Shlam Marava Min Shemaya V'chaim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen Oseh Shalom B'imromav Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Goldberg, for doing all of that text for us. Mazel tov to everybody on the completion of this tractate, and onward and forthwith to Baba Batra. Quick housekeeping point. We will, of course, be in your inbox tomorrow morning with an essay on Bava Batra 2. It's always 2 because the Talmud tractates always start on page 2. Page 1 is a cover page. Also, as many of you know, we run a Thursday morning review that week in Daf Yomi. These teachers are featured in the rotating cast of wonderful teachers we have there. You may be wondering, are we going to do it tomorrow? Yes, we are, but it's going to be forward focused on Bava Batra since we had a chance to celebrate Bava Metzia just now. So look for the link. If you don't have the link for that, look at the bottom of every single Daf Yomi email that we send. Has that information in the footer toward the bottom. You can find it there. Thank you to all of you for your insightful thoughts, questions, comments, for explaining to us why Bava Metzia is usually studied first in a traditional yeshiva. Thank you to our presenters. Always, I learn from you all kinds of interesting things and see the tractate in new ways after being head down editing all for many months on it. And so I appreciate that. And I'm just really grateful for this entire community and the learning that we can do together. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. We will see you tomorrow. Bye.
Thanks, Mazel Tov.
Bye,
Mazel
everyone.
tov, everybody.